Ahoy hoy fellow bookworms, my name is Caroline and I like to read books, so let's talk about them. Today's video is going to be my May wrap-up, and yes, you heard that correctly. This is a wrap-up of the books that I read in May and not July because I'm a little bit behind with these. I read 13 books in May and they were a little all over the place. I read some that I absolutely adored, but I also read some that I really disliked. There were some that I was really disappointed by and some that I just felt kind of meh about. So I think that's enough of an introduction because I have plenty of thoughts that I want to share, so let's just get going. The first book I read was my favorite for the month and is pretty easily one of my favorites for the year so far, and it's Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. I had pre-ordered this book and I was really looking forward to it because Laini Taylor's other series, the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy, is one of my favorites and it really helps me get back into fantasy, and I'm so happy to say that this did not disappoint. Laszlo Strange is like the most precious character ever. It needs to be protected at all costs. Like 10 out of 10 would die for Laszlo Strange. I think he's just the best thing ever. I loved his journey. He's like this sweet little librarian at the start who's just reading about other people's adventures and then gets the opportunity to go on his own adventure, and we just see him grow throughout the book, and it's just, oh, it's just the sweetest thing ever. I loved him so much. At one point he was like narrating his journey out loud and I just felt like crying for him. He was just too precious for words. There are a lot of people who don't like Laini Taylor's writing, and I can kind of see why, because I think she does write in quite a flowery and descriptive way, but I think she always says exactly what she needs to without being too over the top, instead of writing these like long-winded stupid descriptions that don't actually tell you anything. She always says exactly what she needs to in a way that is really lovely and vivid, and I really enjoy her writing, so it's probably not for everyone, but like 5 out of 5 stars to this book. I can't wait for the next one. I enjoyed it so much. Like, wow. After that, I read A Court of Wings and Ruin by Sarah J. Maas, which I have already done a full review of, and I will leave the link to that wherever it goes on the screen, but it is full of spoilers, so don't click on that link unless you have already read this book or just don't care. Keep things spoiler free. I did enjoy this book. I found it incredibly entertaining and I really loved the characters and the world, but it was a bit of a disappointing finale. I think there were certain key moments that fell quite flat and it just wasn't as good as it should have been. I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars, and I definitely think this series peaked with Akamath because that book was fucking perfect. After that, I read The Princess Saves Herself in This One by Amanda Lovelace. This is a book of modern poetry inspired by the author's life, and I actually bought this one after seeing it like super hyped up on Twitter, and I've got to say I found it a little underwhelming. I did enjoy the poetry. There were quite a few moments that were really poignant and beautiful, but overall it was just a little repetitive and a lot of the poems fell quite flat for me, so I enjoyed it, but just not as much as I was expecting to. Next up, I read The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, and this book was just like absolutely phenomenal. This book is inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement, and so there's a lot of really important stuff in here that made me think and made me incredibly emotional. I loved the main character Star. I think she was absolutely perfect as a protagonist. She was real and emotional and she got angry and she was flawed, but I really loved all her flaws because they made her that much more real. I loved her family, I loved the side characters. I found the writing in this to be really powerful, and I feel like most people have already read this, but if you haven't, highly recommend it because I think it's an incredibly important story, and it's actually being made into a movie now, which I'm super excited about because I think it's going to be great. Next up, I read Under Rose-Tainted Skies by Louise Gornell. This follows our main character Nora, who is living with agoraphobia, and that's like a form of OCD and anxiety where you're scared of basically everything, and that's a bit of an oversimplification, but I highly recommend everyone reads this book because I actually found it super interesting. There are a lot of times in this story when Nora gets quite anxious and kind of freaks out a little, and the way that it was written made me feel quite anxious and kind of put me in her place as well, and I think that was super awesome. Although I really enjoyed this book, I did find it quite similar to Everything Everything a few times in that she's confined to her house and kind of falls in love with her neighbor and stuff like that. Also, wasn't really a fan of the ending because I think it kind of came out of nowhere and didn't fit with the rest of the story, but that could just be me. After that, I read volume 2 of Tokyo Ghoul by Sue Yoshida, and I'm gonna say I didn't hugely enjoy this. I still really like the concept of this, where our main character is like half ghoul and half human and trying to balance his 2 lives, but the story hasn't particularly grabbed me yet, and I find the art style kind of up and down. I don't enjoy it at all during combat scenes because I find it really hard to follow. So I'm thinking maybe I will read volume 3 and see how I like it, but this was not my favorite manga ever. After that, I read The Wrath and the Dawn by Renee Ardier, and I had been putting off reading this for so long because I knew I would not like it. And guess what, guys? I didn't like it. I can definitely see why people enjoy it, but I just found it a bit too insta-lovey, and I was really annoyed that at the start we had this badass female character who was ready to murder this guy to save the country, and then 2 nights later she's got butterflies in her stomach even though he murdered her best friend, and then like another 2 days later they're in love. It just doesn't make sense to me, and I can't get over that fact. I will say though that the writing was really good, so that's a positive at least, but I don't really care to read the sequel, and I didn't enjoy this book that much, but I am glad that I finally read it. Next up, I read Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, and I really enjoyed this book, even though it wasn't quite what I was expecting it to be. This is like a post-apocalyptic story with a then and now format, and I just absolutely loved the story and the writing. I loved the observations about life and the mark you want to leave on the world and what happens when we have to start fresh and stuff like that. The writing was just amazing, so highly recommend this one. The next book I read is 10 Things I Can See From Here by Carrie Mack. This is the story of our main character Maeve, who moves to Vancouver to live with her dad, and she struggles with severe anxiety, so this move comes with a whole string of new worries and stresses. But as things kind of settle down for her, she meets this really cool chick named Salix, and the two of them end up dating, so we have this awesome female-female romance throughout the book, and I've got to say, it was like the cutest romance ever. I loved the two of them together. I really enjoyed this book. I loved the family dynamic, I loved the romance, I loved the representation of anxiety, but I do have to say that I think certain conflicts in it were resolved a little too quickly, and at times the writing wasn't the greatest aspect of it, but overall it was a really enjoyable read. After that, I read The Bone Witch by Rin Chapeko, and this is a book that I have really mixed feelings about. I was really excited going into this book because it's about a necromancer, and I feel like there's no books out there that have a necromancer as a hero, and I think necromancy is really cool, so I was excited. But when I read it, it felt just that little bit flat. I feel like the entire middle section of the book was this massive lull in the story. It really reminded me of Memoirs of a Geisha, where they have this whole training section in the middle where, you know, they learn how to dance, they learn how to sing, they learn how to entertain, they go to parties. That was this book, except they'd also thrown in that they learn how to do magic. I just found it really slow, and I don't mind slow books. I actually really like slow books, but when it's a slow book you have to add in extra character development, and I just don't feel like this book did that. The next book I read is The Way of Shadows by Brent Weeks, which, let's be honest, probably has one of the worst book covers ever. Meh. This is another book that I found quite disappointing, which is a shame because I'd been really looking forward to reading something by Brent Weeks, but I ended up just finding it quite tropey. Like, our main character is a street urchin who has no family, and he's trained by this gruff assassin with like a sad backstory that justifies all his actions. And all the female characters are sex workers, except the love interest, who is like perfectly virginal and pure, and it was just really tropey, and I did kind of enjoy all the politicking, and I was still intrigued by the story, but also I found a lot of stuff quite repetitive and unnecessary. I will probably continue this series just because of curiosity, but it wasn't nearly as good as I thought it would be. Next up, I read Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. This is another book of modern poetry, and similar to The Princess Saves Herself in this one, I found this a little underwhelming. I did like this book a little bit better because I think a lot of the poems stuck with me that little bit longer and were a little bit more relatable. But again, I found the book a bit repetitive. I think there were too many poems in there that were saying essentially the same thing in exactly the same way, and I just didn't find that super enjoyable. The final book that I read in May is Men Without Women by Haruki Murakami. This is a book of his short stories and was actually my first time reading any of his short fiction. I'm gonna leave a link in the description box to my Goodreads review of this book so that if you want to check out my individual ratings for each of the stories within this, then you can. But overall, I really enjoyed reading this. There were some stories that I liked more than others, but I think that's always going to be the experience reading a short story collection. My favourite story in here was probably the first one, just because I think it was the most memorable. But what I really loved about reading this short story collection was the variety. I loved that with Murakami we got some that were really like plain contemporary stories, and some were really bizarre, and I loved that we got that mix of things. It was really fun to read. There we go, guys, that brings us to the end of another video. Be sure to let me know down in the comments how your reading month was, because I would love to get some discussion going. I upload videos Wednesdays, Saturdays, and sometimes Mondays as well, so be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in my next video. Toodaloo!